So picture this. It's 2 a.m., you're staring at the ceiling, absolutely agonizing over some incredibly minor, awkward thing you said, maybe weeks or even years ago. We've all been there, right? But why? Why do we care so intensely about what other people think of us? Well, as a professional psychology researcher, this is exactly the kind of question I spend my days investigating, because feeling crippled by the fear of judgment is incredibly common. But the good news? You are not alone, and I promise you, your brain is absolutely not broken.
Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're making it our mission to completely destigmatize this fear of social judgment. We're going to put this universal human experience right under the microscope. We'll look at the psychological and evolutionary roots, and most importantly, we're going to explore some actionable, evidence-based solutions so you can finally reclaim your mental space.
Okay, so here is our roadmap for today. We'll look at the spotlight effect, our evolutionary roots, the looking glass self, internal versus external locus of evaluation, and wrap up with the power of self-compassion.
All right, let's jump right into section 1, the spotlight effect, which is really the core symptom here.
This is that immediate, super relatable symptom pretty much all of us feel on a regular basis. You know the one, that uncomfortable illusion that everyone is watching your every move. So, the spotlight effect is a very well-documented cognitive bias. Basically, because we naturally perceive the whole world from our own localized perspective, our brains take a bit of a mental shortcut. We assume that because we are hyper-aware of our own minor flaws, like, say, a tiny stain on your shirt or a slightly awkward comment you made, everyone else must be intensely focused on them too. It literally feels like you're the main character standing center stage under this blinding spotlight. But the reality? Well, everyone else is just the main character of their own movie, mostly focused on themselves.
Now, while that might just sound like a harmless mental glitch, this cognitive bias actually has real teeth. It actively fuels things like social anxiety and performance anxiety. Because when you constantly overestimate social scrutiny, you become super self-conscious and you develop this really deep fear of rejection. It creates a debilitating cycle, honestly. You avoid taking risks, you shrink away from social situations, and you ultimately limit your authentic self-expression just to avoid some imagined criticism. Which brings us to section 2, evolutionary roots of rejection. Let's look at the cause. So why exactly is our hardware programmed this way? To figure that out, we have to look back at our evolutionary roots, and this is where we can really normalize the struggle. Think about our past as tribal hunter-gatherers. Back then, survival depended entirely on the group. Being ostracized from your tribe meant losing access to food, shelter, protection. It was a literal death sentence. And because of that, our brains evolved to treat social threats with the exact same urgency as physical threats. Brain imaging actually shows that experiencing social rejection heavily activates the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex, or DACC. That is the exact same region that processes the emotional distress of physical pain. So your brain reacts to being left out the exact same way it reacts to being physically injured. Crazy, right? And this leads into a really fascinating concept from psychologist Mark Leary called sociometer theory. Leary argued that human self-esteem didn't just evolve so we could feel warm and fuzzy about ourselves. Instead, self-esteem acts as an internal alarm system, a sociometer. You can think of it literally exactly like the fuel gauge on your car's dashboard. When that gauge detects that your social inclusion is dropping and rejection might be imminent, your self-esteem plummets. It's essentially an evolutionary warning siren telling you to change your behavior and get back into the tribe's good graces before you get cast out. Moving on to section 3, the looking glass self. So we have this highly sensitive evolutionary hardware, but how does it interact with our modern social environment to actually form our identities? Well, back in 1902, sociologist Charles Horton Cooley introduced a foundational concept that still drives psychology today. He poetically stated, "Each to each a looking glass reflects the other that doth pass." What he basically meant was that we don't form our self-concept in a vacuum. We develop our sense of self by looking into the mirrors of other people's reactions to us. Our ego and our identity are just inextricably shaped by our social context. Let's walk through exactly how this plays out in daily life. It happens in 3 really rapid steps. First, you imagine how you appear to someone else. Second, you imagine their judgment of that appearance. And third, you experience an emotional response based on that imagined judgment. So for example, imagine you post a photo online, or maybe you accidentally spill coffee on yourself in the middle of a meeting. You immediately imagine everyone noticing. You assume they think you're clumsy or foolish, and suddenly, this massive wave of intense shame washes over you. You've essentially internalized an imagined judgment and turned it into real emotional distress. All right, section 4, internal versus external locus of evaluation.
Now that we've diagnosed the root cause of all this, let's pivot to some clinical frameworks for intervention. A key concept pioneered by psychologist Carl Rogers is the locus of evaluation, which is basically just where you source your self-worth from. The crucial takeaway here is the contrast between two very different mindsets. Many people operate from an external locus of evaluation. This means relying heavily on the approval of others, societal standards, or material success to validate your choices. The problem with that? It leaves you incredibly fragile, just constantly at the mercy of outside opinions. On the flip side, therapy aims to shift you toward an internal locus of evaluation. This is where you learn to trust your own judgment, your own intrinsic values, and you cultivate unconditional self-acceptance. You value yourself for who you are, creating a really authentic and unshakable identity.
Which brings us to our final part, Section 5, the power of self-compassion.
So, shifting from an external to an internal locus sounds amazing in theory, but how do we actually do it? Well, that brings us to a core element used in modern therapies like acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT. Based on the extensive research of Dr. Kristen Neff, self-compassion rests on three main pillars. First is self-kindness, replacing that super harsh inner critic with warmth and understanding, basically treating yourself like you would a good friend. Second is common humanity, recognizing that making mistakes and feeling inadequate is just part of the shared human experience. You aren't some isolated failure. And third is mindfulness, observing your negative thoughts and painful emotions without judgment and without over-identifying with them. It's about allowing the pain to be there without letting it define who you are.
And we can actually ground this clinical advice in physical reality. Research shows that self-compassion actively deactivates the brain's threat system. So, one incredibly simple, practical technique when you're feeling a spike in social anxiety is to use soothing touch. Seriously, just gently placing a hand on your heart or giving yourself a subtle, gentle hug. This physical gesture actually releases oxytocin. It provides a sense of security and measurably calms cardiovascular stress. You are literally biologically signaling safety to your own body. Another really actionable clinical exercise used to build this internal locus is the Gestalt two-chair dialogue. You essentially set up 3 chairs, one for your harsh inner critic, one for the part of you that feels judged, and one for a wise, compassionate observer. By role-playing these different parts of your mind, you cognitively diffuse from the anxiety. You literally step outside of the self-loathing and learn to observe your own thoughts. It creates the space you need to respond to yourself with kindness, rather than destructive criticism. So, we've covered a lot of ground today, from the primitive alarms in our brains to the modern psychological tools we can use to calm them down. The spotlight effect and our evolutionary fear of rejection are totally natural, but they absolutely do not have to dictate your life. By shifting your locus of evaluation inward and practicing self-compassion, you really can break the cycle of anxiety. So I'm going to leave you with this provocative thought. As you go about the rest of your week, ask yourself, whose mirror are you looking into today? Are you letting the imagined judgments of others define you, or are you ready to evaluate yourself from within? Thank you so much for watching this explainer, and I truly hope this helps you reclaim your authentic self.